All right, let's talk about the beginning of political parties in the election of 1800. Now that we've had a constitution approved, we've had our first president, the government's figuring out how it's working. We talked about that briefly in the George Washington block. Now people are starting to think about the direction that the country should go. Not how the country should be run, but beliefs they have. Should we have a bank? Should we not have a bank? How are we going to finance things? What type of economy are we going to have? So they start breaking into different groups, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to get to the election of 1800 that was really nasty. People think about elections today being nasty. They're not even close to what 1800 was. And it could have ruined the country, but it didn't. So here we go. These are learning objectives. We're going to talk about some of the different issues that led to the forming of the political parties. As mentioned, banks, alliances, economy. We're going to talk about the differences between our first two political parties, which don't exist anymore today. We're constantly evolving. We're going to talk about the outcomes of the election of 1800. And we're going to talk about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Two pieces of legislation that really are kind of a black mark on the country here, but we'll talk about those in a minute. So our first two political parties, like I mentioned, the country started breaking into factions or groups of people who had similar visions for how the country should go in the future. Now, you're going to hear some terms, but you need to forget the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Those are no longer needed. That was only to support the Constitution. What type of government should we have? A federal or not federal type of government? So our new two topics to learn, our new two terms to learn, are Federalist and Democratic Republican. Those are our first two political parties. And you'll see the term Democratic Republican. It sounds kind of crazy because today we have Democrats and Republicans. But back then, the term Democratic Republican means you're in a democracy and you're a republic, so you're representing the people. The people are important. And for the Federalists, it wasn't so much about the people. It was more about the right thing to do. Well, for everybody. So what makes a political party? It's their interpretation of different things. Are you a strict reader of the Constitution, or do you think it's a living document, a loose interpretation? Are you more industry business, or are you more agriculture? Is it a regional thing? Are you from the north, the middle, the south, or the west? What are your leanings on? How does your geography affect what you believe the country should go for? So now we have two parties. You have the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. As I mentioned, forget Federalist and Anti-Federalist. Because you'll see over here, James Madison, who was a very strong Federalist in terms of the Constitution, is now a Democratic Republican. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson opposed each other with the Constitution. Jefferson did not like it. James Madison wrote it, but now they're Democratic Republicans. Hamilton and Mason supported each other for the Constitution, but now they're opposing each other in the direction the country needs to be going. So these are our two parties. Now let's kind of look at what they believe. The Federalists, Alexander Hamilton was their leader. They support a supreme federal government, that it should have more power than the states. It should be very industrial based. You see a big industry picture here. They wanted a national bank, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, to do the nation's banking. They wanted an alliance with Britain, to do more trade with Britain, military alliance, all kind of things like that. And they supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. Just give me a few. We'll talk about what those mean and the reasons for them. But they supported these Alien and Sedition Acts. The Democratic Republicans believed just the opposite. Thomas Jefferson was their leader. He was very vocal. He's now back in the States from his term as U.S. ambassador to France. He thinks the national government should be divided into a federal government, state and local governments, with all of them being kind of equal within their realms of responsibility. He looks for an agricultural economy. Of course, he's a big farmer. He wants us to be more agricultural and produce goods to send out to other people. He is opposed to the national bank. He thinks it's illegal. It's unconstitutional. He doesn't see a reason for it. And having been an ambassador to France, and a lot of people have, he supports an alliance with France. He doesn't like England, never did. Since the revolution, he thinks France has more ideas that they ought to be going to. France is just had their revolution. over there, and so they're going more toward democracy, whereas Britain has still got a king. And he's opposed, and all the Democratic Republicans, they're opposed to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So this national bank is an idea of Alexander Hamilton, and he was brilliant, don't get me wrong, and here's his idea. He believed this would encourage the development of American industries, big business, whatever the industry is, shipbuilding, farming, fishing, you name it. All kinds of different industries they were hoping to build. But his plan was really intended to enlist the rich and well-born, meaning those born and educated into good families, to run the federal government. But for this bank, he wanted a place for the nation to deposit money, issue money, and make loans. He didn't want them going to any single bank, because that would kind of show favoritism. But he wanted a national bank run by the government to do exactly what needed to be done for the country. That is actually a picture of the first national bank in Philadelphia. Hamilton's opposition was Thomas Jefferson. He was his biggest critic. Jefferson was a great believer in the common people and called for true democracy where everybody gets a vote. Hamilton called democracy a poison, and he distrusted the common man as being uneducated and unable to make big decisions that impacted the country. And he questions if this, Jefferson, he questions if this national bank is even legal. So some of the things about the federal government, the Democratic Republicans believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it's not in there, it's not there. You got to change it. You can't read into it. You can't think what it means. You have to read what it means. The Federalists believe in a loose interpretation. And this because it provides for and justifies use of power. And it leads to an increase of federal power, because they can kind of read what's not in there. So Democratic Republicans believe in a strict view. The Federalists believe in a very loose interpretation it's more of a living document and can change by interpretation. Now these Alien and Sedition Acts, we mentioned them earlier, that the Federalists supported and the Democratic Socialists did not. So the Alien Acts were about immigration. Now, the Federalists believed there were French spies everywhere plotting to overthrow the government. So they wanted to restrict immigration, specifically the French. Remember, the Federalists supported an alliance with Britain, and Britain and France are at war at the time here. They restricted immigrants by changing the time to wait for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. The bill and the law said the president can expel or throw out whoever he wants from the U.S. if he thinks of them as dangerous. If they think, hey, Mr. Smith is dangerous, get him out of here. But these really targeted the French. The Federalists wanted an alliance with Britain, who were at war with France, and it was kind of a religious thing too. The French are Catholic when the U.S. was mainly Protestant. And they didn't like each other very much. There was still a lot of resentment between religions. So these laws really helped stop immigrants from voting for Democratic Republicans in elections. Then you had the Sedition Acts. This is part of the two acts that were passed here. Sedition is really censorship, where you can't say anything bad about the government. It made it illegal for anybody to criticize the government. As you can tell by just watching the news today, people say bad things about the government all the time. So the Sedition Act is no longer the law. But it was a constitutional problem. I mean, were these legal to do or not? We have freedom of speech. A lot of people went to jail because they were criticizing the president. They weren't renewed when they expired in 1800 and 1801. Here's a cartoon from back then. As gag rulers, which means people who want to gag rule or to put a gag in the people, in the mouth of the people trying to speak against the government. That's what you call a gag ruler. As gag rulers would have it, that they would be, the sedition bills are a big snake ready to go and eat the little small helpless children who are honest opinion, free speech, and free press. So this is speaking against the sedition bills. So now, John Adams becomes president after George Washington. So John Adams becomes is coming up for re-election in 1800 for re-election. So we have an election in 1800. Jefferson decides to run against him, so it's Democratic Socialist versus Federalist. Many would call this the Revolution of 1800 because it really changed and people were really scared of what was going to happen. It was a very violent, nasty election. Jefferson's ideas were very different from the Federalists of Adams and Hamilton. It was one of the closest of all times, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it did set up the first political control transfer through a democratic election, a peaceful transfer from one power to another. In the past, in most of the world, it had happened by assassination or death or coup, military takeovers. But this was an election, and the loser left office. The winner took over. It was peaceful, and the country kept going. So let's see what happened. So how these parties different? The Federalists are supported by the wealthy. Again, that strong federal government. They support the national bank, emphasis on manufacturing, loose interpretation of the Constitution, and they want a British alliance. The Democratic Republicans, support by the people. They want a strong state government. They oppose the bank, emphasis on agriculture, farming, strict interpretation of the Constitution, and French alliance. So here are the results. You can see the Constitution states that the two highest vote getters are elected president and vice president. Well, you see there's a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his vice presidential candidate. So both of them would be president, and John Adams and his vice president were, and John Jay, they were all running on the Federalists. So they have a problem. They have a tie, and how do you break a tie? Well, in the Constitution, it says it goes to the House of Representatives because that's the house that represents the people. So let's talk about what happened there. The House is deadlocked. Lawmakers are having to vote. The congressmen are having to vote on who to win. They vote 35 times, and nobody has a majority, either Burr or Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, pictured there, is a Federalist. He hates Aaron Burr, even though Aaron Burr is a Democratic Socialist you just saw. He believes that Aaron Burr is dishonest and deceitful, and this goes back to a long family feud they've had. Aaron Burr said something about Hamilton's father, grandfather, and his family. So he convinces other people to vote for Jefferson, who's not his party. He's not somebody he agrees with, but he believes Jefferson is much less evil than Aaron Burr. So Hamilton finally convinces one person, a member from Delaware, to vote for Thomas Jefferson, and that finally ends the deadlock on the 36th vote. And we have a winner, Thomas Jefferson, who becomes president, serves for 2 terms, excuse me. And we'll study Thomas Jefferson in a minute, but change is coming. Because of that tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and Burr, it shows they need to have separate ballots for president and vice president, and that's what the 12th Amendment to the Constitution does. It was proposed in 83, and the states quickly ratified it, and it was ratified in June of 1804. But this also shows the peaceful transition of power between two parties. Again, Thomas Jefferson took over, and John Adams left, went back to Boston. There was no military presence. Nobody cried foul. It just was, one guy was president one day, and one guy was president the next. And that's the same peaceful transition of power you'll see today, even as contentious as the election was between Mr. Trump and Senator Clinton in this last year. Ms. Clinton gracefully bowed out. There was a peaceful transition, and she was there at the inauguration of Mr. Trump as he became President Trump, which deserves a lot of respect. In summary, this was the beginning of political parties. George Washington and a lot of the early founders did not want parties. They did not like that idea, but they came. The election was vicious, and it could have destroyed the nation, but it didn't. Thomas Jefferson, he won after a split decision, but his administration didn't destroy the nation. It didn't do a lot of things that the Federalists said he would, and he peacefully transitioned to the next president. And the 12th Amendment changed how we elect presidents and vice presidents today. So that's it. Hope you got something out of it, and we will see you in the classroom.